Welcome again to Illuminated, a talk show that discusses solutions to real-world problems. I'm the state chair, Joseph Michael Carr, of the Independent Voters of Illinois Independent Precinct Organization, better known as IVI-IPO. I'm here tonight with our Public Relations Chair and co-host, Jim Garfield. I'm going to turn it over to Jim. Jim?
Hello and welcome to Illuminated, a program from the Independent Voters of Illinois Independent Precinct Organization, or IVI-IPO. I'm your host, Jim Garfield. I'm here joined, this is part 2 of our conversation about folks who have sexual offenses in their history and their challenges finding housing. This is part 2 of this program. We're joined once again by our wonderful guests, Adele Nicholas and Pam Rodriguez. Thank you so much for coming back.
Thank you.
And I want to just jump right into this. There's actually an op-ed that was written by you and Rebecca Janowitz, who is actually the IVI-IPO's program director, so who helped put this whole thing together, which talks about the crazy web of housing restrictions don't keep anybody safer from sexual assault. And the main thrust of the article, or of the letter, seems to be that we're asking the wrong questions of not why are so many people trying to live in the same place who have a sex offense, but why do they need to? Because it seems like and this, correct me if I'm wrong, the law is that you can't have more than one person per housing unit, which is a building, whether it's a house or an apartment complex, that has someone with a sex offense conviction at the same time. Is that right?
While they're on supervised release. So post that term, if it's 3 years, or we've said it could be lifetime. So if you're not being supervised on mandatory supervised release, multiple people can live at the same address. But yes, that is correct. The reason for the article was that there are some organizations that are trying to provide housing for people who have sex offense histories and are trying to get out of the Department of Corrections, and there have been landlords who have been willing to provide housing locations for folks, and community members were up in arms about that. And our argument has been that the housing for folks should be normalized, that we want people integrated into community, that's actually safe and safer than what we're currently doing. You've heard Adele say we have discredited laws and we have discredited policies and practices in the state of Illinois, and we should really be asking what is effective, what does work, and how can we support people and communities to live their best lives. The stories of people who have been impacted by these laws are just heartrending. You heard Adele reference them in a previous segment about people owning their own homes, people having to pull their kids out of school with little to no notice, separating from one gentleman was taking care of his mother for many years and ended up having to move out of the house that she owned, live on a golf course, and try to help her maintain her mortgage. It's just horrific what we have done. I think what politicians have done, it's kind of a routine thing to pass get tough on sex offenses thing as a part of rite of passage, so that when someone tries to run against you the next time around, no one can say you're soft on crime. When in fact you are contributing to homelessness, you are contributing to breaking up families, you are contributing to stigma and harassment and harm, and doing nothing to make communities safer. You're not focusing on the victim, you're not focusing on restorative justice, you're not focusing on any of the things that evidence-based policy and practice would suggest would be far more effective and result in better protection for and better prevention services. Instead, we just do these very easy soundbite, punishment enhancements to make us feel safe for our next election.
Now, it does sound fairly straightforward of I'm going to be tough on crime, I'll be tough on, of all people, sex offenders. We punish that very strongly in our system. When we say that, is there, I'll say, a scale of sex offenses? Is it anything at all from, being an 18-year-old who's streaking across the high school football field as a prank and someone sees it, all the way to like aggravated sexual assault, which is a severe felony? Is there any gradient in the law for different types of offenses?
I think that's one of my biggest objections to these laws is that lawmakers behave as if there is some category of people called sex offenders, and then they all have some common characteristic that makes them dangerous. But the truth is, this is a very large and heterogeneous group of people, and like people who've been convicted of any other type of crime have different capacities for reform and doing better and leading positive, productive lives. But we act as though it's reasonable and logical to kind of legislate and regulate and punish these folks as a class. But there's really no scientific or legal or even logical basis for that, because as you observed, we regulate somebody the same regardless of what the offense is, how long ago the offense was, how much they've done to grow and change and have a positive and productive life, the extent to which they've taken responsibility and been held accountable. We don't look at any of that. We just think that once somebody has a conviction in their background, that says something fundamental about them that they can't change. And that's just not true.
And just in general, the notion of offense-based sentencing and offense-based strategies are pretty much across the board discredited. They used them with people who committed drug crimes, right? And if you had 5 grams of a drug, you got this sentence, and if you had up to 15, you had a different sentence, as if that offense should drive both your punishment and your rehabilitation, right? And what we're trying to get people to move more toward is an individual response. So, you talk about people who've demonstrated capacity to change and to be restored to family and friends and employment and all kinds of things. And that's a very different person than someone who is unwilling to take responsibility, unwilling to do the work to become a productive participant and member in society. And so any offense-based strategy like that is going to give us a false sense of safety and over-punish some folks and completely miss other folks who need better supervision and better and longer surveillance, whatever it might be. And that's not just for people with sex offense histories. That's all kinds of offense histories.
Now, is there any validity to the pushback and the argument of, right, but we, the residents in the neighborhood, we don't know whether it was that they were urinating behind a trash can after a ball game or they assaulted someone. We only know it's a sex offense, and we don't want that person living near us. What's the pushback to that kind of I don't want to say a NIMBY argument, not in my backyard, but we don't know which one it is, we just don't want any of them. How does that respond to that?
I think everyone who's involved in this work and the members of the communities who are affected by these laws and the people who are living in homes and neighborhoods where they don't want people they perceive as dangerous or undesirable, we all have a common interest in rational, evidence-based policies that work. And we all want safe communities. We all want to have safe, stable places to live where we can enjoy our lives and be positive and productive. And the laws we have right now don't achieve that goal. All the laws that we have now do is force people into homelessness. and marginalize people and make it impossible for them to maintain stable employment because we subject them to all of these requirements that just take up so much of their life that it's very difficult. So I guess what I would say to somebody who says, well, I don't want this in my neighborhood, the solution is out there, and it's changing these laws because these folks, by and large, do have places to live. They have families that love them. Many of them own their own homes. They have spouses. They have children. They have parents and grandparents who they could live with but for these laws. So that's the solution, is that we get rid of these discredited laws and policies that are forcing people into homelessness and let them live.
Now, what's a good way, I'll say strategically, to go to a politician who's writing the new laws and say, hey, if this isn't working, here's how we need to make it, here's how we need to change the law to make it more effective, without them looking weak on crime, without them looking like they're giving in to sex offenders? How do we strategically do that?
So I'm a member of the Chicago 400 Alliance. And the Alliance is a group of folks, individuals, and organizations that support changes in these laws and policies. The Chicago 400 are people who are experiencing homelessness because of these laws and policies. And they are incredibly effective advocates when they speak for themselves. The reason I got involved in this was because I got to know them. I got to know their stories. I got to hear about the injustices impacting them. I got to, we rode to Springfield together. I picked a bunch of people up and we all drove to Springfield to talk to legislators. One gentleman brought his son with. Other times people will bring their family members. And once we accept that the people we're talking about are people and human and they're not scary and they are providing for their families, they are working 1, 2, 3 jobs and providing for their kids and they're not allowed to be there, it becomes easier to stand beside them and say this is a really discredited policy. And then you have people like Adele who have the law, the science, the effective policies as further evidence of what does work. Illinois there are like 22 states, I think, that don't have housing restriction laws, that don't have them because they know they don't work. So if we're going to be a state that is fair and just and committed to evidence-based practice and not just vindictive revenge and surveillance, we'll be informed by people who've been impacted. We'll be informed by the work that Adele does. We'll be informed by the Chicago 400 and 400 Alliance and learn. It takes time. Don't expect anybody to change their mind overnight, but there are lots of ways to educate yourself. Very few sexual assaults even are reported. So if you think you're safe just because you know the name of one person who is on a registry and that makes you somehow safe, it doesn't. The best means of prevention aren't knowing who the 1 or 2 offenders are, but it is learning what sexual assault prevention looks like. It's helping young people report assaults, right? Most assaults happen between people who know each other. And that's a really hard thing for people to hear. But when you know that most assaults happen, on college campuses or in families, it changes how you think about what effective policy looks like and what effective prevention looks like and what effective intervention and treatment looks like. Services for victims look very different when you understand that the victims probably knew their perpetrator. And so it's more complicated than just an ineffective registry that makes me feel safe, but actually is probably doing the opposite.
So is there, in either of your opinion, is there a state that we should be emulating, that we should look at and say, hey guys, the 50 little laboratories of democracy, our laboratory is not working so well, we should be more like this other state? And are there any models we should be looking to?
I guess I would point to Minnesota. The Minnesota legislature was considering adopting residency restrictions, and they were looking at a variety of different policies they could adopt. But they wisely decided to do a study to see whether this would be effective. And they did a very broad, deep study that was conducted by the Minnesota Department of Corrections to look at whether residential banishment zones would have prevented any of the sex offenses that had occurred in the state over quite a long time period. And they studied every single one of them, and they found that not a single offense had been facilitated by someone's residential proximity to the person that they hurt. And they decided based on that it really wasn't logical to adopt residential banishment zones if they don't do anything to prevent offense. It's we've talked a lot as the pandemic is changing and our public health response to it is changing about hygiene theater. I think we have public safety theater happening with a lot of these laws, is that it's something that lawmakers get credit for because it's a soundbite, it's a gimmick. It sounds like they did something to care about public safety, but the evidence is out there, and our lawmakers, if they looked at it, would have to be a little bit more honest with themselves about what they're really doing. Which is adopting discredited policies that only drive homelessness and re-imprisonment without giving us any appreciable public safety benefits.
Is there any concern that there's I won't say a push, but a lack of push on this because reincarceration, until recently, Illinois had private prisons that had contracts that had to be filled a certain amount of capacity, and we paid them lots of money. Is there any thought that perhaps these laws haven't been changing because until recently there was a profit motive for having people reoffend and end up back in the prison system? Or is it just poor statutory writing?
Well, we didn't really have for-profit prisons. We're not like some other states. We had some programs in the prisons that provided treatment services. So there wasn't so much motivation to keep prisons filled. What I would, rather than say why we didn't do something, because I think we've kind of talked about, the politics of that.
Sure.
I would like to say that the Chicago 400 has been working first with Representative Slaughter and then Representative Lilly, Senator Hunter, and a few other people to try to make changes in a couple of things that we've been talking about today. One is changing the 500-foot rule to a 250-foot rule. That would help. That would help a lot. Wouldn't end the problem, but it would be a gradual approach to eventually going to real evidence base, which would be to eliminate that entirely. And then related to that, if somebody had an approved host site, it could not be unapproved just because somebody moved in next door with a daycare center or something. So once you're in a safe house, you can stay there. You wouldn't have to break your lease. You wouldn't have to lose your house or anything like that. So we're working on that with the Black Caucus primarily. And
has there been much, I'll say, movement in that direction? Or is it just it's a slow process?
It's a slow process. Okay. And what the Chicago 400 and the 400 Alliance are doing is trying to do community organizing by getting their members out, discussing this not just with legislators, but obviously with legislators, but also with communities. So this is, I really appreciate the show and the opportunity to educate your audience. This is going to be really helpful. And then the other thing that the 400 is working on is the reporting requirements. So if you're post-supervised release and homeless, you have to report weekly to the police department on your address, where you've been, where you've slept every night, all that kind of stuff. And it can never be in a restricted area. And we're trying to get that changed to to be more in line with other reporting requirements, quarterly or annual, as opposed to weekly. People are losing jobs. People can't take jobs because they have to report weekly. And you can just imagine all of the chaos that creates in a person's life. The Chicago Police Department processes 25,000 of these things a year because people have to report weekly. So we're trying to get that changed, and we're going to we're going to gradually try to push back on some of the policies and practices at the Department of Corrections, et cetera, in order to increase the certainty with which people are able to leave the department and not stay there long beyond their sentence and things like that. So, so we're hoping that these kinds of programs, et cetera, will increase people's interest in learning more about it and hopefully supporting some of the changes that we hope to propose.
You mentioned problems with employment. There are a lot of municipalities throughout the state that require you to live in the city if you want to work in certain, especially municipal jobs. Given the zone restrictions and the forbidden areas, things like that, how much of the cities are generally cut off for access? If someone wants to live in the city so they can work there, how much of the city are they generally not able to live in?
So I think a huge problem that people face is there's no real way to know the answer to that question because no one creates an official map. You can't access an official map of where the restricted locations are. But anecdotally, people who are looking for housing will have sometimes dozens of addresses rejected. Entire neighborhoods are off limits, especially in a city like Chicago where there's density. Almost all residential housing is within 500 feet of something that is prohibited.
Now, I want to talk about the second class action suit that you were working on, which I believe the name Barnes v. Jeffries. I don't know how much you're allowed to talk about it if it's still ongoing litigation, but there was a recent summary judgment in that case. Can you tell us about what that was about?
Yes, so I've been working for a long time on behalf, well, with my law partner, Mark Weinberg, who I don't want to leave out of this, of course, but he and I have been working for about 5 or 6 years on issues facing people who can't get out of IDOC because they don't have an approved place to live. And we've had this federal injunction in the Murphy case for a long time, but so many of our class members were still stuck. A year after the injunction had been entered, there were still 300 people who were doing an indeterminate amount of supervised release in prison with no end in sight. And we realized that one of the laws that was really driving this was a restriction that said anyone who was on supervised release who had a sex offense conviction in their background couldn't live at the same address, the same building, the same apartment complex, or even the same trailer park as another person who had a registration requirement. And in our years of doing this work, we'd never heard the state articulate a public safety rationale even, not even a supposed rationale for why they had this law. And so since that was one of the biggest drivers of keeping people imprisoned past their release dates, we filed another lawsuit so that people could be released to family homes that might be in the same apartment complex or condominium building as another person who's on the registry. Because if you think about it, we've already put all of these 500-foot banishment zones around all of these locations. And then let's say, by the grace of God, there is one apartment building with one landlord who's actually willing to rent to somebody who has a felony conviction in their past. Well, they can only rent to one person. And they might have a willingness to rent to 2 or 3 other people, but they couldn't. The landlords weren't allowed to do that because of this law. And so we filed a class action lawsuit to challenge that law. The court found that due to the lack of any public safety justification for it, it was unconstitutional to the extent that it led to people being imprisoned past the completion of their court-ordered term of incarceration.
Now, is this more against the Department of Corrections, against the state? Who's the actual, I'll say, target of the lawsuits like this?
So in both of these cases, they're against the Department of Corrections is really the defendant, because it's not so much, it is really a challenge to how supervision is being carried out in Illinois, as opposed to any one particular law. I think we have a situation where we have this overlapping web of laws and policies and individual discretion of parole agents that's been given by the Department of Corrections. So the defendant in these cases is the DOC.
Now, in this case, are there kind of policy changes? Is anyone working on policy changes with the department to make it more in line with, well, reality and with the court orders?
Do you want to talk about that, or
Well,
you talk about your side? I'll talk
yeah.
about mine.
Okay. So, I mean, we continue to work closely with the Department of Corrections to try to identify compliant housing that our clients can go to. And I do give the Department of Corrections some credit for at least having an interest in complying with the injunction that's been entered by the federal court. They're not there yet, and it's moving very slowly. But they're at least collaborating with us to the extent that, you know, we've proactively been looking for landlords who might be willing for addresses that might be compliant, even trying to look for, you know, creative solutions like churches that might be willing to help people. I mean, of course, this all could be solved much more easily if our lawmakers were willing to pass the bill that the Chicago 400 has been working so hard on. But setting that aside, you know, we are continuing to work with the Department of Corrections to try to identify compliant places for people to live.
Okay.
And so what we're doing is the 400 is working on two things related to that. One is to clarify that more than one person at a particular address, that it's okay statutorily. And so while the department may be resistant, we want to be permissive, right, with regard to instructions so that they know that. And then the other thing that we're also working on is the department has theoretically the capacity to fund and support some transitional housing. And but the rules and the requirements to provide that transitional housing are over the top onerous. They're and based on old logic from 15 years ago. And so our goal is to modify that, and we're working, again, to do that legislatively. In other words, to tell them it's okay, please do it, you know, above board. And we're working with, probably going to be working with a couple of representatives, Representative Cassidy and LaPointe, probably on that.
Fantastic. Well, it sounds like this is a developing issue. I hope that it does continue to develop, and that I hope it does continue to develop, and that as we have more progress, we can have you back on to discuss what changes have actually happened since this program. And thank you so much for joining us. Our guests tonight were, of course, Adele Nicholas and Pam Rodriguez. Thank you both so much.
Thank you again for watching Illuminated with IVI IPO. You've watched Jimmy Garfield and Joseph Michael Carr. If you're interested in becoming a member of IVI IPO, visit www.iviipo.org. If you want to renew your membership, you can follow that website link and renew your membership as well. Thank you again. Take care.